If there's two things about NeXT computers a whole bunch of people think that they know, it's the following. That it was created by Steve Jobs and has something to do with Apple, and that some guy called Tim invented the internet on it. Both of those facts are not entirely correct. So we're going to have a bit of a look at the history of NeXT and at this NeXT color workstation. Ooh, isn't it pretty? Now, it's impossible to tell the history of NeXT without discussing Steve Jobs and Apple, because, yeah, those two things are fairly related, so I'm not going to try. So we're going to start with Steve Jobs and Apple. While still at Apple, Steve met Paul Berg, who at that time had just won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, and was trying to persuade Steve Jobs to use his position at Apple to create a 3M computer for universities. Now, a 3M computer was a goal first suggested by Carnegie Mellon University. The idea was it would be a machine with 1 megabyte of memory, 1 megapixel of graphics, and 1 million instructions per second. Hence the 3Ms. It was also suggested that it would be ideal if it cost less than 1 megapenny, which is $10,000. Now, the 3M concept must have interested Steve enough, as he assigned a number of Apple staff to start looking into Apple making its own 3M machine. However, things were not entirely rosy in the world of Apple at this point in time, so this 3M machine would never come to fruition. Apple had had a number of major missteps since the beginning of the 80s. For example, there was the Apple Lisa, a project started by Steve Jobs, which Apple's board would forcibly remove Steve from, before eventually going on to remove him as CEO entirely. The Lisa project began in 1978, with Steve being removed from the project in 1982 and the machine finally being released at the beginning of 1983. It was a Motorola 68000 base machine with 1 whole mega RAM and a GUI, and an absolutely staggering price tag of $10,000. Now, $10,000 still seems like a lot for a computer now, but in 1983 that was a massive sum of money. I mean, in the UK, that was house buying kind of money. I mean, not a big house, not a nice house, and a house in an area that best be described as stabby. But still, a house. Now, none of you will be surprised to discover that the Apple Lisa sold poorly. Very, very poorly. So, having been kicked out of the Lisa project, Steve decided to take over the Macintosh project, which was originally intended to be a text-based machine, and he turned it into a GUI-based machine selling for under $1,000. Now, the Macintosh did a lot better than the Lisa, which, let's face it, was not hard. But despite the fact of how we think of the Macintosh now as the future of Apple, when the Macintosh first came out, it didn't sell brilliantly. It didn't sell badly, but yeah, sales were not great. Eventually Mac sales would pick up quite substantially. But not until there were things like a second model of it, and an add-on card which let you run Apple II software. So these problems led to the board removing Steve as CEO of Apple. Now, Steve Jobs didn't leave Apple straight away after that. He stayed there for a while in an attempt to sort of, fight to regain his position. When that didn't work out, Steve Jobs eventually left Apple. But Steve Jobs was not the kind of man just to sit on his hands and take up gardening. Oh no. He was going to create another computer company, and that computer company was NeXT. When Steve left Apple to go form NeXT, a number of key Apple employees came with him, all of who had been assigned to the Supermicro group that Steve had tasked to look at the 3M problem. Now, did Apple like this? No, it really didn't. In fact, Apple sued NeXT for nefarious schemes. The accusation being that Steve would use his insider knowledge. Now, one quote from Steve Jobs at the time for this was, "It's hard to think that a $2 billion company with 4,300 plus people couldn't compete with 6 people in blue jeans." After a short period, Apple dropped the lawsuit, leaving NeXT free to get on with creating their 3M machine. Now, initially, the NeXT hardware team were looking at Motorola's 88000, a new RISC-based processor that Motorola were working on. However, it did look like there were going to be supply problems with that chip, and also, it was going to be implemented in more than one silicon package, which is going to be a lot more work for the NeXT team. So they decided to go with a 68000-based CPU that they were already very familiar with. And for the initial NeXT Cube, that was the 68030. Now, initially NeXT had planned to just be a hardware company, but 1 year in, NeXT decided that it would become a software company as well and develop its own operating system, NeXTSTEP. NeXTSTEP would become one of the big things that NeXT was known for. It was a well-regarded operating system with a really nice UI, which we'll get to show you in a bit. But there is a downside to the NeXTSTEP operating system. Yeah, NeXTSTEP was the thing that kept Objective-C alive. The company formed by the two creators of Objective-C, PPI, was having some financial difficulties about the same time NeXT was setting up its software team. This meant that PPI was laying off some staff and, well, NeXT was just over the road from them, so as Steve was looking to hire software people and PPI was getting rid of software people, NeXT hired PPI's people, and with them came Objective-C. Now, no offense to any Objective-C fans out there, but I am not a fan of Objective-C. If you're not a developer, you probably don't think that programming has an aesthetic, but it really does, and Objective-C just offends every programming aesthetic I have. And if NeXT hadn't been looking for software engineers at the very time that PPI was letting engineers go, well, they probably wouldn't have chosen Objective-C for, well, anything. And a whole generation of software developers could have been saved the pain that is Objective-C. I mean, it makes Perl look good. But we don't live in the timeline where Objective-C is merely a footnote in the history of object-oriented development like Smalltalk. Oh, thank God for Swift. Apart from its abhorrent choice of development language, NeXTSTEP also took a few steps away from the usual Unix way of doing stuff, especially when it came to the GUI. Almost all of the Unix flavors use X Windows for their display system. But NeXTSTEP eschewed X Windows and went for Display PostScript. OS X users may well be familiar with that term, because it's the display technology that used as well. Display PostScript was based around the PostScript standard from Adobe that initially was created to, well, run laser printers and the likes. Display PostScript differed in that it was intended for the screen, but also allowed multiple applications at once to send multiple streams to the Display PostScript handler, whereas in PostScript there would just be one stream received by the printer that described the whole page. NeXT used this Display PostScript technology to create a really nice looking UI. This made it one of the prettiest looking Unixes out there. I mean, you should see OpenWin that Sun had. Yikes. On the looks front, really the only competition NeXTSTEP had was IRIX from SGI. The aesthetic and looks of everything to do with NeXT was clearly very important to Steve Jobs. For example, in 1986, Steve hired graphic designer Paul Rand to create a brand identity for NeXT for $100,000. This was years before NeXT even released their first ever computer. This concentration on look, aesthetics, design would become a hallmark of Steve Jobs once he returned back to Apple. In the October of 1988, NeXT finally released their machine, the NeXT computer. Boasting a 68030 processor clocked at 25 MHz and a floating point unit, it came with a whole 8 MB of RAM, was expandable up to 64 MB. This machine sold in reasonable number to academic institutions, and, most famously of all, was purchased by CERN, where Tim Berners-Lee created the world's first web server and the world's first web browser, thus inventing the World Wide Web, and not of course the internet, which is the thing that it ran on. After the NeXT computer came the NeXT Cube, a very similar machine to the NeXT computer, only now it had a 68040. Ooh. It's also around this time that NeXT introduced the NeXT Station and the NeXT Station Color, the machine we have here. Now this is probably a good time to take a look at the machine we've got in front of us, this NeXT Color Station, and it does look pretty good. So this doesn't have the cube design of the earlier NeXT machine. Instead, what NeXT have gone for is what was referred to at the time as a pizza box design. Now this machine has a 68040, just like the NeXT Cube, which is clocked at 25 MHz in this case. If we had the turbo version, it'd be clocked at 33. By default, it's shipped with 12 MB of RAM, and could be upgraded to a total of 32 MB. Now it has its own separate VRAM, and there's a whole 1.5 MB of that, which allows us to have 4096 colours at once. If you have a look at the side, you can see we have a 2.88 MB floppy drive there. And if we go around to the rear, you can see you've got a number of ports. We'll start with the power port. If you can see those metal fins, they make up part of the cooling system for the power supply. There's a fan inside the NeXT that essentially blows air over those fans to cool the PSU. As you see, next we got the Ethernet port, and we can have either the normal twisted pair type or thin coax. We then have a port for their proprietary laser printer, followed by one for the monitor. That's a DB13W3 connector, which is very common on Unix workstations of the time. We then have a DSP port, which honestly I haven't been able to find out much about. And the two ports A and B that look like keyboard and mouse connectors, they're not, they're serial ports. And finally, last but not least, we have an external SCSI port, which is pretty much the standard way to attach CD-ROM drives and the likes at this point in time. Now some of you may be wondering, come the end of that list of ports, so where do you plug in the mouse and keyboard? Well, the answer is this speaker here. Yep, the speaker is where you plug in the keyboard and the mouse, and there is a reason for this. In the original NeXT computer, this bit of circuitry was inside the monitor, so you plug in the monitor and your mouse and keyboard, yeah, they plug into that. When they came to design the NeXT workstation, it seems at some point later on in the design of that machine, they decided that they'd use generic monitors with a black case. That way they could source monitors from different companies. But it seems it was a bit too late in the day to adapt the design of the NeXT workstation to have, a keyboard and mouse port. So they took all the electronics that were in the monitor and they shoved it in the speaker box, and that now plugs into the monitor port, which totally makes sense. In fact, if you open the speaker box up, you'll actually find on the PCB in there, there's an internal connector that would have linked up to the display. This of course now means that the speaker is absolutely vital to the operation of the machine, so if you're ever buying one of these things and it doesn't come with a speaker, don't buy it or you won't be able to plug a mouse and keyboard in. Now, while we've got this thing here, let's open it up and have a look inside. Now you'll see the whole case is held together with one whole screw. This is like the easiest machine in the world to take apart. We pop out the one screw and lift up the lid. While we're on the topic of the lid, just have a look how thick the metal this thing's made out of. This is a surprisingly heavy-duty, nice case lid. Having now found my anti-static chopstick, we shall now have a little look at the PCB itself. Now, as you can see, we have ourselves a nice CPU here. Yes, that's 68040. We have the RAM banks, using 72-pin SIMs. We have a number of Motorola support chips here, including our DSP. How exciting. Here you can see the VRAM chips. And finally we have a SCSI connector for the internal hard drive. Oh look, and there's a floppy drive. Right, so we put this thing back together. It's time to boot this bad boy up. Now, you might have noticed that there was no power switch on the machine at all. It's powered up using the power button on the keyboard. So again, if this does not come with the original keyboard, you are gonna have issues turning this thing on. And as you can see, it powers up very nicely, but no display. Okay, I admit, I kind of expected this to happen. This is just a fairly cheap generic VGA type LCD monitor, and probably doesn't support the video standards that this machine uses, even though I've got the converter cable to adapt it to VGA. VGA cable can actually carry multiple video standards, and this monitor doesn't support the one that this machine uses. Fortunately, I have an OCS scan rate converter which will take this signal in and spit out HDMI, which I can then stick in my capture box, plug that into my laptop, load up a bit of software, and lo and behold, my laptop is now the monitor to my NeXT workstation. Yay! So why this thing boots? Let's talk about what happened to NeXT next. The NeXT workstations and cubes, they were pretty successful. I mean, they weren't the biggest selling Unix workstation out there, but they did more than well enough and people really liked its operating system. But there was a looming problem for NeXT. Their competitors in the form of Sun and HP and SGI were all moving to bigger, faster processors. Sun created its Spark processor, HP created its RISC-PA chip, and SGI acquired MIPS. And this left NeXT with, still 68,000. And then Motorola announced it was going to discontinue 68,000, and NeXT was, what's the word I'm looking for? Screwed. Yeah, that's the one. They didn't really have the money to develop their own chip or the in-house expertise. So, NeXT decided it was going to become purely a software company. Yes, they would stop making their own workstations and start selling their operating system NeXTSTEP. They would also start selling off their GUI toolkit, OpenStep, as an add-on for different operating systems. This was made available for Spark, Sun, x86 and a number of different platforms. This revised business model, it was not easy for NeXT. Problem is, developing an operating system is expensive. You need quite a lot of people. The next problem was, for every platform they made NeXTSTEP for, there was already a dominant operating system in place. So, for Sun, there was Solaris, and if you've just bought a hugely expensive Sun workstation, you're not going to want to spend more money on a different operating system that runs slightly less software than the onboard one does. Again, for x86, DOS and Windows pretty much ruled the roost. And if you chose not to run DOS and Windows, there were already Unix operating systems long established on the x86 platform, like Xenix, OpenServer, Unixware, and new up-and-comers like Linux. All this meant that NeXT software sales were not exactly as NeXT had hoped. Meanwhile, back in the first computer company Steve Jobs had founded, Apple, things had been trundling along relatively well for quite a while. The Apple Mac had gone on to sell quite a lot of 68,000 base models and had now moved on to the PowerPC. But quite a few things were, not quite right with Apple. Firstly, they had a gazillion different models of PowerPC based Macs, available in any colour you like as long as it was beige. And the Mac's operating system had turned itself slowly into a basket case. Yes, despite its shift to PowerPC, it somehow not managed to gain protected mode, so one application could just happily write into the memory space of another, or in fact in the kernel of the OS itself. This led to it increasingly growing a reputation for being quite unstable. Also, a lot of the add-ons to the operating system now were just one layer of kludge upon another, again contributing to that, increasingly crashy reputation. Now, it's not like Apple weren't aware of this and didn't attempt to fix it themselves. They came up with a whole new operating system generation under Project Copeland, a project that went precisely nowhere. This thing was stuck in development hell for years. It was always seeming that it would be available either in the second quarter of next year or the quarter after that, and yet never did actually get released. Eventually, Apple decided to go looking for an OS vendor. And I know what you're thinking. Yay, they're going to come and rescue NeXT, that's what's going to happen, right? And yeah, you're right, eventually, but not yet. Yes, despite the fact of what Jobs the movie seems to think, Apple didn't come straight to NeXT door. No, the operating system Apple had in mind was B. BOS was pretty darn popular at the time and was growing, and it looked very much like Mac OS. And it had all the features that Apple were looking for, like protected memory. But negotiations with B broke down as B wanted, what Apple regarded as way too much money for their operating system. And with B not willing to budge and Apple not wanting to budge, negotiations just broke down. And that's where we come to NeXT. Financially, NeXT was struggling a bit. So when they were approached by Apple, let's say they were open for offers. Apple paid $429 million in cash, and 1.5 million Apple shares went to Steve Jobs, who then became a consultant for Apple. The acquisition of Apple didn't mean that NeXTSTEP instantly replaced Apple's OS. Now, a lot of heavy development work went in using NeXTSTEP as the base to create an operating system that was much more suitable for Apple's look and feel. In fact, while Apple completed its acquisition of NeXT in 1997, OS X wasn't released until 2001. The other major change after NeXT's acquisition for Apple was that Steve Jobs would return as CEO and begin the phase for Apple of what was, its most successful period, introducing the iMac range, the iPod, and then finally onto the iPhone and iPad, making the version of Apple that we all love and fear today. Right, now the desktop's loaded up, we can have a little bit of a look at it. Now, those of you with some passing familiarity with OS X may notice some elements that, went straight into OS X. They're in different places, but they went straight in. As you can see over the right side of the screen, we have the dock. Yep, this is where OS X's dock started. It's along the side rather than at the bottom, but you can see the whole concept is there with the icons we can launch stuff from. It's just a really useful way to get to the software we're going to use the most often. Other elements, as you'll see over to the left, we have a sort of menu bar that changes context based on what application is currently loaded, very much in the way that the classic Mac OS did, only it's at the side in this little block rather than at the top. And again, this is an element they kept in OS X, but it went back up to the top like in the classic Mac. But you might also notice the services menu that exists in OS X now. Well, this is where it originated here. There's also quite a few widgets that are in here that, went straight to OS X, like the font selector, etc. The applications are also packaged in directories with a .app extension, just like they are in OS X. Again, this is where that started, which at the time was very unusual for a Unix environment. Well, it still is. Most things in Unix live in a sort of user bin, user lib hierarchy. Now, one of the most important things about this desktop environment is the bit you don't actually get to see. Underpinning all of this is an object-oriented API that lets you do all the widgets and windows, etc. Now, at the time, this was the first object-oriented API for doing UIs. Yep, other windowing environments existed, but they just had a straight, regular C-type API of, a series of function calls, rather than a series of objects. There was also a nice UI design set of tools as well. Now, despite the fact that you had to access all of this via Objective-C, this was actually quite a nice environment in many ways. And while, eventually every other system would catch up eventually getting its object-oriented system, like the Microsoft Foundation classes or OWL, at this time this was unique enough that eventually when NeXT span off, essentially to be a software company, just the windowing environment, that was sold out as a separate product called OpenStep. And they made this available for most other major commercial Unixes like Solaris, but also it was available for Windows NT as well, so it gave you a real cross-platform development system you could make use of. Now here we have the world's first web browser, called World Wide Web. Yep, it was created by Tim Berners-Lee when he was at CERN, and was initially just available for NeXTSTEP. Now, one thing I should mention is, it's not just a browser, this is actually also a web page authoring tool as well, which is kind of the original intention of the web. It wasn't going to be a read-only media. The intention was that everyone would be able to and could create web pages. Now, normally when I make these videos, I usually make a joke about, yes, we got to show Doom, that's compulsory. Well, on NeXTSTEP, actually, yeah, no, we really do have to show you Doom. Now, there is a reason for this, because originally, Doom was developed on NeXT. Now, I know there'll be a bunch of you watching this who are now itching to type into the comment section, no, it was on PC first. Yep, I mean, they sold it on PC first and released it on PC first, but they developed it on NeXT. Now, mostly this was due to ease. At the time, DOS could only run one thing at once, so debugging and tasks like that, yeah, they were not super easy. On NeXT, you got the interactive debugger, and all of this can run at the same time as the game. They also built all their level editing tools, etc., again, all on top of NeXT. This built-in Unix developed for DOS technique that they created here, well, that would continue on even once they stopped using NeXT and moved on to Linux as their development platform. Yeah, I should also mention the little window you can see with Doom running here. Yeah, that's actually the full standard DOS resolution right there. It's just the NeXT has such a high resolution, that's how much of the screen it takes up. You can actually expand that up to do like 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, but at that point, things start to get a little bit chuggy. Networking-wise, NeXTSTEP supports IP version 4, just like you'd expect for any BSD-derived Unix. We also have a rather nice UI to be an NFS client, which actually I'm making use of to make this video, as NFS hasn't really changed very much, so my Synology NAS, yep, that does NFS, well, yeah, I can still easily access this using the NeXTSTEP client, which is where I've been installing all my software from. Now, something that's a bit unusual for Unixes of the time, and in fact, even now, as NeXTSTEP has built in a fully functional NetWare client. Now, at the time, NetWare was principally targeting DOS and Windows machines, but also had pretty good support on the Apple Mac. So maybe we shouldn't be that surprised to discover that there's a decent client built into NeXTSTEP here. Now, one thing it is missing is there's no support for binding to a Windows file server, so no SMB or CIFS or LANman, whatever you want to call it. Now, there is a reason for that, and it's not just they were being a bit anti-Microsoft. Oh no. No, at this point in time, LAN Manager or Windows NT, again, whatever variant you're thinking of, didn't really have much in the way of market share. NetWare pretty much ruled the roost, so there was not much point to going to the effort of building a client to connect to a thing that most people didn't actually use on their LAN. Times have certainly changed a bit on that front. Now, I mentioned earlier on in this video that NeXT didn't make use of X windows. Instead, it used display PostScript. Now, this display PostScript system made it pretty nippy. You can see here how we can drag around windows and the whole window moves around, all the graphics and everything, which nowadays, yeah, that's nothing. But back then, most windowing systems, when you dragged them, the window turned into a wireframe so you didn't have to keep redrawing all the complex graphics inside. So this was a pretty neat trick. It's also something Steve Jobs made a pretty big deal of when they were doing the launch presentation for NeXT. Yeah, you won't be surprised to discover that a Steve Jobs-style launch event is exactly what happened for NeXT. And it looks very much like a lot of the Apple ones we'd all see later. The only thing that made it a bit difficult is the big app that they were demonstrating was Mathematica. Yeah, now this was aimed at a sort of science community. There was, however, a downside with display PostScript, and that was, yeah, the entire rest of the Unix world used X11. That means you had a GUI app you wanted to port from any other Unix environment, well, yeah, that was difficult. So, unsurprisingly, NeXT got an X server. In fact, it got a few, including the one I'm going to install here, which was pretty popular at the time, Coexist. Armed with this, it means you can port pretty much any X Windows app and just run it on the NeXT. All you have to do is recompile it for the Motorola 68000. And this neatly brings me on to the next web browser I'm going to show you, Mosaic. Now, this is the first ever web browser I used, and this is the web browser that basically popularized the web and included such novel features as allowing an image in a web page. Yeah, exciting times. Yeah, before that it had been very text-only. What I'd say about the whole NeXT desktop is, it is a very good looking UI, especially for the time, and given, well, the relatively modest levels of hardware in this thing. It is only a 68040, which at the time was the top end of the 68000 range, but still. This is just at the end of 68000 being a CPU that you could use in a, well, Unix desktop machine. Yeah, the RISC processors were all just on the horizon and things would leap forward processing power-wise significantly. But NeXT looked massively better. If you compare this to Sun and Muse, dear God, and the whole open win look, yeah, I'll just show you that. Yeah, you can see, yeah, NeXT is a lot prettier. Admittedly, SGI was also very pretty. In fact, yeah, okay, I prefer the SGI desktop if truth be told. But also, SGI was using massively more powerful hardware in the end. And while NeXT never gained huge market share, I mean, Sun pretty much dominated in their SGI and HP, but NeXT earned itself a dedicated following, and you can see why. Also, NeXT has that whole mythos now about it being the foundation of what Apple would go to do next, which makes NeXT maybe bigger in some people's imagination than perhaps it actually was. But still, as you can see, this is a pretty good UI experience, and that's what they were aiming for. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed this video all about NeXT and the NeXT Station colour. If you made it all the way through to this point, thank you very much for watching. As ever, if you liked this video, please give it a nice thumbs up because it helps other people find it. As with sharing it with others you feel might enjoy it. And as ever, I'll mention please subscribe because it does make a huge difference to people finding this channel.